Hello class, this is Dr. Anderson and we are going to be discussing the female reproductive system, and you can see my email and my phone number if you want to contact me with questions. Our learning objectives for this presentation are the following. We want to discuss the structures of the ovary, namely the follicle and then the corpus luteum, that are involved in hormone and egg production. And in order for the ovary to produce hormones, there has to be a regulation system. Sometimes the female cycle operates according to negative feedback, but in the middle of the cycle it converts to positive feedback and then converts back to negative feedback, and I'd like students to be able to explain that. Females make two reproductive hormones, progestins and estrogens. I'd like you to be aware of their functions and to be able to compare and contrast the jobs that progestins and estrogens do. Finally, we need to put together a big system called the menstrual cycle. There are things going on in the ovaries, there are things going on in the uterus, there's some things going on with cervical mucus, things going on with hormones, and we need to put those all together and think about that, how that starts up at puberty, how that continues through the childbearing years, and then how that changes with menopause. Alright, so this is a picture from your textbook showing a side view of the female reproductive organs. So we see very prominently the uterus, and the biggest layer of the uterus is called the myometrium. It's a smooth muscle. Typically the smooth muscle in the uterus is multi-unit. However, at the end of pregnancy, all those cells link up with gap junctions and become single unit, and we'll talk about that in another lecture. The lining of the uterus is the endometrium. That's the hormonally sensitive part. We'll spend a lot of time talking about that. The opening to the uterus is called the os, and that connects the cavity of the uterus to the birth canal or the vagina. Now, the vagina is kind of an ecosystem unto itself, in that there's a population of bacteria, lactobacilli, there we go, that digest sugars and glycogen and make an acidic secretion. This is actually protective for the vagina, because the fallopian tubes actually open right into the abdominal cavity. And so if you recall from our lecture on male reproduction, there is bicarbonate in sperm and in semen, and that seminal bicarbonate helps neutralize the vaginal acid. The vagina opens up into a space called the vestibule. On either side of the vestibule are the labia, and then there's a sensory organ called the clitoris. Now notice that also opening into the vestibule is the opening to the bladder. In males, the reproductive and urinary tracts share a common urethra, but there is a separate opening for the urinary tract in females, and the urethra is much shorter, and so anatomically females are more vulnerable to bacterial infections, just because the bacteria have a shorter distance to travel in the retrograde direction. You see over to the side here a little bit, you see a little bit of the fallopian tubes, the openings that sort of surround the ovary, and then there's the major reproductive organ, the ovary. So here's a frontal view, and there are the ovaries on either side. There's the fallopian tubes, and the fallopian tubes just kind of form a cloud around the ovary. You have no idea which ovary is going to produce the egg, and if it's coming from over here or coming from over here. There have been situations where this ovary ovulates, but then the egg then travels down this fallopian tube. All kinds of interesting things have happened. But I also want you to notice, you can see much better in this picture, how the fallopian tubes open right up into the abdominal cavity. So typically, substances have to cross a cell layer to get inside the body. Here's the exception. Bacteria could make their way up into the reproductive tract, go through the fallopian tubes, and get access to the abdominal cavity. That's something called pelvic inflammatory disease. It actually can be very, very dangerous, and that is the necessity for the acid in the vaginal tract protecting the reproductive tract from germs and invaders and that kind of thing. So here we see the ovaries. They are the major reproductive organ, and they have two jobs. They make eggs. Eggs is a general term. We'll use the word oocyte and ova and that sort of thing, but in general you can call those eggs. And they make hormones. So estrogen and progesterone are being secreted from the ovaries. There's some other things, inhibins, activins, relaxin is a hormone that's produced particularly during pregnancy, making female gametes and producing sex hormones. All right, in the embryo, a female, remember in the embryo that the embryo sorts of starts out androgynous. You don't know if it's a male or a female based on the structures. And if it's a boy, then there's an expression of an SRY gene. If it's a girl, then there's no expression of the SRY gene. So then the embryo then develops into a fetus, and in the female fetus are ovaries that are filled with stem cells called oogonia. Remember the stem cells in the males were called spermatogonia, and the stem cells in the female are called oogonia. These cells undergo mitotic division and supply the cells that are going to participate in gametogenesis. So a baby girl is born with 2 to 4 million oocytes. Now notice we've gone from oogonia to oocytes. They all differentiate, they all start meiosis, and then they sort of stop. So a baby girl is born with 2 to 4 million of these oocytes. She grows up, and over her lifespan she may ovulate 400 of them. When she runs out of oocytes, then she comes to the end of her reproductive life. And the traditional view has been that all the stem cells enter meiosis, stop, so that there are no remaining stem cells in the ovary. Remember, in the male always has a supply of stem cells. So males can theoretically reproduce the rest of their lives. Females don't do that. However, some stem cells have been found in the ovaries. Now, what that means in terms of reproduction, I don't know. And if the presence of those stem cells can be used to treat, say, infertility at some point, that remains to be seen. I'm just letting you know that perhaps not all the stem cells enter meiosis. So we always have to be ready to think in a new way. You know, we have a hypothesis, we test the hypothesis, we gather a bunch of data, we form a theory, and then some new information comes along that may change the way we think about things. This is a very, very cool picture showing all these little follicles that this baby girl has been born with. And actually, I don't know if this is human. This might have come from a non-human primate. But you see all these little primordial follicles, and they're all sitting here waiting for some hormones to tell them what to do. So once a girl goes into puberty and is able to produce oocytes and that sort of thing, there are some events that occur in the ovary. There's a hormone that's produced from the anterior pituitary called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and that is produced in high levels in the beginning of a menstrual cycle. And FSH, as the name implies, follicle stimulating hormone, causes a few of the ovarian follicles to develop. So they're little primary oocytes in little tiny follicles, and they start to grow. the follicular cells surrounding the oocyte start to produce estrogens. And essentially, as those cells produce more estrogen, they're encouraged to produce even more estrogen. So it's as if there's a little positive feedback mechanism going on right in the follicle. As estrogens increase, then follicle stimulating hormone is inhibited by negative feedback. Now, if we assume this woman is having a 28-day cycle, about day 7, one of the follicles stands out as the dominant follicle, and that's the follicle that's going to be ovulated. After about another week, then ovulation occurs. The thing is, though, the entire follicle is not ovulated. Just the oocyte and a few of the surrounding cells. The rest of the follicle stays in the ovary. It is acted upon by a hormone called luteinizing hormone, which turns those remaining cells into a new structure called the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum actually means yellow body. Corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone and lasts about 14 days. And then it dies, endometrium sheds, and the cycle then starts all over again. So here's some pictures to help us see what we're talking about. So we see the ovaries on either side of the uterus and near the opening of the fallopian tubes. So we have some primordial follicles that are then acted upon by FSH. They turn into primary follicles. They continue to grow. One in particular matures. We call it a mature follicle, a dominant follicle. They're also called Graafian follicles after the person Graaf, who first discovered the follicles. And notice there's an oocyte with some cells and kind of a fluid-filled cavity, and then a bunch of cells surrounding the fluid. So notice it's just the oocyte and a few of the cells that are ovulated, and those remaining, the rest of the follicle stays in the ovary, is acted upon by LH to become the corpus luteum, which means the yellow body. See how they've drawn it yellow. It lasts for a couple of weeks, and then it dies and turns into a little scar we call the corpus albicans. So initially you have a little primary oocyte with a layer of cells around it. And those cells grow and reproduce with the help of follicle stimulating hormone. And these first cells that are produced are called granulosa cells, and those are the cells that make estrogen. And then you start to see another layer appear, and those cells are called theca cells. So what actually happens is the theca cells produces an androgen. That is sent over to the granulosa cells. The granulosa cells contain aromatase, which then can take the androgen and turn it into estrogen. So notice how this follicle continues to grow, but it develops a structure where the oocyte is surrounded by a little bit of a cell, a little layer of cells, but there's this cavity that forms, a cavity called the antrum. So this is filled with fluid, and this fluid has glucose and oxygen and all those sorts of things, so that the oocyte has the nutrients it needs. And we're also setting up a structure that will enable the oocyte to be ovulated, but all of these other cells will remain in the ovary and will eventually become the corpus luteum. So if you remember, I guess I didn't put that the diagram in there, but when when we talked about male reproduction, I showed you a general drawing of meiosis. So meiosis is essentially two divisions after one DNA replication. And then there's some crossing over and some independent assortment that make the resulting cells haploid and genetically unique. And we saw in the male that one spermatogonium becomes 4 haploid unique sperm. We're going to see a little different thing going on in females. Alrighty? So in the fetus we have these oogonia, or oogonium in the singular. These are the guys that are going to undergo mitosis and develop a population of stem cells. While in the fetus, most of the oogonia, so there are a few that may stay as stem cells, but the majority of the oogonia progress into meiosis and become primary oocytes in primordial follicles. All right? They start meiosis and they arrest there. Essentially, the chromosomes replicate, they cross over, they line up on the metaphase plate in homologous pairs, they start meiosis 1 and then they freeze. So then this baby girl is born and these oocytes sit around waiting for somebody to tell them what to do. And that happens with puberty. With puberty, then these follicles start to develop again. So with puberty and the secretion of FSH, we have a follicle that starts to continue through meiosis, and the follicle around it grows. Now, this is a primary oocyte in this growing follicle. With the release of LH, LH is going to tell this follicle to burst and ovulate. It's also going to tell this oocyte to divide, and it is. And it's going to divide into one secondary oocyte and then a little cast off of genetic material we call a polar body. So the cell that is ovulated is a secondary oocyte. This secondary oocyte is released into the fallopian tubes, waits for some sperm to show up, and if some sperm do show up and fertilize this secondary oocyte, then that's the stimulus for the second meiotic division. And so then again, now we have a mature ovum that's also a fertilized ovum and another little genetic cast-off. The polar body from the first division, it may divide again or it may not. Now, all of these, the polar bodies and the ovum are within this group of cells. And we actually want to hang on to these little polar bodies because they're full of nucleotides, all kinds of nucleic acids, and this little developing zygote is going to need all those things to start dividing and making this new organism that was produced from the zygote. All right, now we got to talk about the hormones. So again, we have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus produces a peptide called gonadotropin-releasing hormone that goes into the portal system and acts upon the anterior pituitary cells. And those cells make two hormones, FSH for stimulating the follicle and LH for creating the corpus luteum. So early in the cycle, FSH stimulates the follicle. The follicle grows and makes estrogen. As estrogens increase, estrogen feeds back and inhibits FSH and GnRH. So that's negative feedback. But the thing is, estrogen keeps being produced, keeps being produced, keeps being produced, and then it crosses this threshold to a positive feedback mechanism where high estrogen actually leads to a big spike in LH. LH then causes that first meiotic division, causes ovulation, and causes the production of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum then produces not only estrogen, but high levels of progesterone, lots and lots of progesterone. And the cycle then goes back to negative feedback where LH inhibits the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. So estrogen is very important for bringing about the process of ovulation. It's important for puberty, developing female structures, and in the early parts of the, say up through day 10, it's going to inhibit the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. There's another hormone called inhibin. Inhibin, when it starts to be produced, inhibits the release of FSH in addition to estrogen. Now that's a good thing. We stimulate a few follicles, but then we're going to figure out what happens to those follicles. We're going to see the development of those follicles through to the end before we develop any more. You see that our textbook author talks about relaxin, which inhibits smooth muscle contractions, also is important for sort of relaxing the pelvis with pregnancy. Here we have progesterone. Progesterone is a differentiator. So estrogen causes things basically to grow and proliferate. Progesterone causes things to differentiate. It causes the endometrium to become more specialized, and it stores glycogens and some lipids, but glycogen that serves as an energy source for the embryo if the egg gets fertilized. It also participates in negative feedback regulation. All right, now, what's going on in the uterus while we have follicles developing and ovulation and a luteal development and secretion of hormones? Well, first about 5 days of the menstrual cycle is the bleeding phase or the menstrual phase. Why is that? Well, the corpus luteum died. And when the corpus luteum dies, the estrogen and progesterone production dies with it. You don't have estrogen and progesterone to maintain the endometrium, and so it sloughs off, and that's when the woman bleeds. The thing is, when estrogen and progesterone are low, then you lose the negative feedback inhibition on the hypothalamus, and GnRH goes up, and then FSH goes up. FSH then stimulates the follicle. The follicle then starts to produce estrogen. So then we go from the menstrual phase to the proliferative phase. Estrogen causes the cells in the endometrium to grow, and they grow in number, and the endometrium gets thicker. Estrogen continues to increase. We get that positive feedback mechanism. We get the LH spike. And then we have a corpus luteum that's producing progesterone. Progesterone is a differentiator, and it encourages that endometrium to store glycogen, to literally turn into an exocrine gland and store nutrients in case the egg is fertilized. So we can put some things together in this table. Please don't memorize the table, but think about how to work through it. So day 1 to 5, what's going on in the ovaries? We have the development of the follicle because we have high FSH. What's going on in the uterus? The lining is bleeding because estrogen and progesterone are low. FSH stimulates the follicles, so the follicles continue to grow, but now the endometrium proliferates under the influence of estrogen. Estrogen gets so high that on around day 14 we set off a positive feedback mechanism that leads to ovulation. And that ovulation occurs because of a large surge or a large spike in LH. LH then causes ovulation and causes the formation of the corpus luteum. So now we're in the luteal phase, and while the corpus luteum is producing progesterone, the endometrium is becoming a gland that stores glycogen, and we call this then the secretory phase. Alrighty, so we're putting it all together now. Early in the cycle, the lining is bleeding. The lining is bleeding because estrogen and progesterone are low. Because estrogen and progesterone are low, there's FSH being secreted by the anterior pituitary, which causes development of the follicles. As the follicles develop, the follicle starts to produce estrogen. And as estrogen is produced, it causes the endometrium to grow. Estrogen then feeds back and inhibits FSH. However, estrogen continues to increase, continues to increase, continues to increase, and then it suddenly goes from negative feedback to positive feedback, and we get this spike of LH that causes ovulation. We get the second or the first meiotic division, we get the release of the oocyte, and the ruptured follicle then is encouraged to turn into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum produces not just estrogen, but progesterone, and progesterone takes this growing endothelium and makes it into a gland that stores glycogen and prepares for the implantation of a fertilized egg. After about 2 weeks, the corpus luteum dies. It turns into a little scar called the corpus albicans. It no longer produces estrogens and progesterones. There's nothing to sustain the lining, and the lining dies, and the woman bleeds. So I've referred to this LH spike. Now we finally get to see it. So early in the cycle, FSH is high and estrogen is low. FSH stimulates the follicle, and the follicle then grows. And then as estrogen rises, estrogen feeds back and inhibits FSH. Do you see how it goes down? But estrogen keeps increasing and keeps increasing. It's like when we've got that dominant follicle, it goes on autopilot. It encourages more and more estrogen production, and estrogen increases and increases and increases and increases until we switch from negative to positive feedback, and we get this big spike of LH. LH is the stimulus for the first meiotic division, for the release of the secondary oocyte, and for the development of the corpus luteum. So estrogen goes down for a little bit because we have to rearrange all those cells, but as they turn into the corpus luteum, there's some estrogen, but look at all the progesterone. That last half of the cycle is really dominated by progesterone, which turns and feeds back and inhibits the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary and promotes the storing of glycogen in the endometrium. In the middle of the cycle, we have a positive feedback mechanism. So what we have found through research is that there are sort of two types of neurons in the hypothalamus. There are negative feedback neurons and there are positive feedback neurons. So when estrogen is very, very low, GnRH increases and FSH increases because we're not inhibiting the negative feedback neurons. As estrogen increases, we inhibit the negative feedback neurons and FSH goes down. But as estrogen gets higher and higher and higher, estrogen reaches a point where it's high enough where it sets off the positive feedback neurons. Those positive feedback neurons increase GnRH, increase LH. We get an LH spike and ovulation. Once ovulation is over and we start producing progesterone, we go back to a negative feedback cycle. So this is an interesting picture that I found in an article where a woman was in surgery and her surgeon looked over and said, "Oh my goodness, let's get the camera," because the follicle was ballooning out and there was the egg being ovulated over time. I think this is the first picture. Then we go here, and then we go here, and the oocyte surrounded by its granulosa cells is just about to be released. This right here is called a hemostat. They're kind of like scissors with little teeth. And just to give you an idea of how large a structure this is. So we have estrogens and progestins. Estrogens is the main category. But the specific hormone that's produced most abundantly in human females is called estradiol. Estradiol promotes growth of the breasts and the reproductive structures. It promotes positive feedback at ovulation. It promotes the production of a cervical mucus at ovulation that forms little strands. And those little strands help the sperm find the os of the cervix and helps them swim right up in the reproductive tract. So when the woman is bleeding, there's hardly any mucus. As estrogen starts increasing in the proliferative phase, the mucus is watery and it kind of increases in abundance. At ovulation, then the mucus turns into these little strands, and the strands help the sperm swim through the cervix. Now, many reproductive physicians and researchers are interested in cervical mucus because it seems to have a profound effect on fertility, and many women use a method called the Crichton method. It's actually a more sophisticated version of the rhythm method, where women test their cervical mucus on a daily basis, and when they detect the stranding of the mucus, if they want to get pregnant, then they can have intercourse. If they want to avoid getting pregnant, then they avoid having intercourse. And it's used as a natural birth control method. All right. Now, in the second half, the cycle's dominated by progestins, and the most abundant in females is progesterone. Progesterone is a differentiator. Progesterone causes the breasts to turn into a gland, causes the endometrium to turn into a gland. And so it promotes implantation and pregnancy by producing this wonderful glycogen-rich surface for the embryo to implant. Progesterone inhibits smooth muscle contraction. This is very, very important throughout pregnancy. So in your pregnancy CT, I want you to think about all the things progesterone could be doing to promote a relaxed and myometrium. Finally, after ovulation, there is no need for sperm or anything else to be entering the reproductive tract. There's no reason for anything to get into the uterus. So progesterone produces this very thick cervical mucus that blocks up the cervical opening, and that's in place during the secretory phase. Now, how does this all start? Around age 8, the hypothalamus has a change in sensitivity. See, before that, the hypothalamus was really, really sensitive to just small levels of estrogen. And then around age 8, the sensitivity changes, such that the hypothalamus isn't very sensitive anymore. It's like, wait a minute, where's my estrogen? Where's my sex hormone? I'm not sensing it. So the hypothalamus starts to produce GnRH. That's the first thing that's going to happen in puberty. GnRH leads to the production of FSH and a little bit of LH. FSH is going to start to develop some follicles, and you get estrogen. Estrogen is going to help develop the breasts, help develop the genitals. So there's the thickening of the labia. There's a laying on of fat for more of a female body type. So estrogen then also starts to grow the endometrium. And around age 12, this girl is going to have her first period. But it's possible that she didn't ovulate. And it's not uncommon for the first few menstrual periods to be anovulatory, or without ovulation. Why is that? Well, the follicles are immature, and they produce enough estrogen to develop the breasts. They produce enough estrogen to grow the endometrium, but they do not produce enough estrogen to set off the positive feedback mechanism. There's no LH spike, and therefore there's no ovulation. Now later on, as she matures, and that could be 6 months or that could be a year, then her follicles are mature enough to produce those high levels of estrogen that are then able to set off that positive feedback mechanism, the LH spike, and therefore ovulation. Now what happens on the other end of reproductive life? Around age 50, the ovaries essentially run out of oocytes and follicles. So, the ones she has left just may not be very functional. So what do you think would happen to estrogen production? Well, it should go down. It should go down. And as estrogen production goes down, then FSH will go up, GnRH will go up. Some people think it's low estrogen, and some people think it's high GnRH that causes the hot flashes that some women can experience. But she has some estrogen, she can grow the endometrium, and so women who are just in the process of menopause, and that's called perimenopausal, around menopause, these women can still have periods, but they're less likely to ovulate. And the reason is, for the same reason in the young girls, they have enough estrogen to have a period, but they don't have enough estrogen to set off the positive feedback mechanism and ovulation. Alrighty, so what happens when a woman takes a hormonal-based contraceptive method? Well, you're adding exogenous hormone, adding hormone from the outside. And when that happens, you change the production of the woman's endogenous hormone secretion. So when estrogen is added to the cycle, basically you promote a negative feedback mechanism. You decrease FSH. There's not as much endogenous estrogen production. There's not as much proliferation. And as a matter of fact, that's why some women take the pill, because they have monster periods that don't allow them to leave the house. And if you're at home listening to this, please don't laugh. It's not funny. It can really have an impact on a woman's ability to work, or ability to carry out her daily life functions. So she might take the pill to keep her periods more manageable. All right. So if the cycle remains in a negative feedback mode, when you add that exogenous estrogen, then you decrease FSH production. Endogenous estrogen will be less, and if it's less, then there's no ovulation and less proliferation of the endometrium. Now, estrogens are hormones that increase clotting factors, so there's a very high level of estrogen at the end of pregnancy that helps prepare the body for the birth process. That's a good thing. But women who take the pill are increasing their clotting factors, and therefore should never, 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 never smoke. Now, I don't think people should smoke anyway, but women should not smoke and take the pill. That is a blood clot waiting to happen. That blood clot could break off, lodge in the lungs, that causes a pulmonary embolism, and that can kill you. So if you have any friends who are taking the pill and they're smoking, please tell them to quit smoking, and if they can't do that, they need to try a different form of birth control, because it really can be quite dangerous. And I will stop being your mother and preaching at you, but it is a serious thing. Alrighty. So I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope you found it helpful. Keep on working on those learning objectives. Keep on working on your critical thinking exercises. They will be so helpful to you. Please let me know if you have questions. Post them on the forum. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Hang in there, keep working hard, and I'll see you in class next time.